Good day and welcome back to our Age of Reform in the United States from 1820 to 1860. I had a part one video in which I talked a bit about the history of the Age of Reform, about the religious revival movement, and how that started along with the temperance movement to start moving west and even into the south. But now we're into our part two of the video where we want to talk about some of the other ages of reform, in particular the idea of educational reform, women's rights, and the movement into abolitionism or the stoppage of slavery. So let's start off with the general umbrella of educational reform. In 1800, Massachusetts was the only state requiring free public schools that were supported by community funds. Any place else in the United States at this time, if you wanted an education, you were going to have to pay for it, or you were going to have to send your child away somewhere in order to get them an education. Now, middle-class reformers during the Age of Reform called for tax-supported education, arguing to business leaders that the new economic order needed educated workers. If you were going to industrialize, you need to have workers that could read. You would need them to be able to have simple math. They need to be able to write down their name. Now, under Horace Mann's leadership in the 1830s, Massachusetts created a state board of education and adopted a minimum length school year. Now, this also provided for the training of teachers and expanded the curriculum to include subjects such as history and geography. We're starting to see the formation of a public school system that would be used in order to have other states pick up the sense of reform as well. Now, by the 1850s, the number of schools, attendance figures, and school budgets had all increased sharply across the United States. School reformers enjoyed their greatest successes in the Northeast and the least amount of success in the South. Southern planters opposed paying taxes to educate poorer white children. Their own children were getting fine education through tutors. They also didn't want to see the enslaved have an option or a chance at it. Educational opportunities for women are also expanding at this time. As children, both males and females were allowed into the local schools tax-free, and now we start seeing women attending women's colleges. In fact, in 1833, Oberlin College in Ohio becomes the first co-educational college where both men and women are attending together. And 4 years later, the first all-female four-year college is founded, Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts. Some of the women educators that you're going to see pick up the torch as well is going to be perhaps the Troy, New York's Female Seminary, where our curriculum is going to be more than just teaching a young woman how to take care of the home or how to work in perhaps some sort of mill. And the curriculum is going to be math, physics, history, geography, what you'd expect as normal today, but was far from the normal back in the 1800s for women. This female seminary is also going to train female teachers. One of them that you're going to see take on quite a prominent role is Emma Willard. And Mary Lyons is going to, in 1837, establish Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts as the first college for women. Now, we're also going to see some reform when you talk about orphanages, jails, hospitals, and we're going to call that the prison or the asylum movement. Now, asylums isolated and separated the criminal, the insane, the ill, and the dependent from outside society. They would call this rehabilitation. So the goal of the care in asylums, which had focused on confinement, is now shifting to the reform of the personal character. One of the first founders of the asylum movement is Dorothea Dix, a Boston schoolteacher who took the lead in advocating state-supported asylums for the mentally ill. She attracted much attention to the movement by her report detailing the horrors to which the mentally ill were subjected. For example, when she would go into the asylums, she'd see people being chained, kept in cages and closets, even being beaten with rods. In response to her efforts, 28 states create their own and maintain their state mental institutions by 1860. Dorothea Dix also discovered that people were placed in prisons for debt, people were subjected to cruel punishment, and children were not treated any different than adults were in prisons. She is responsible for helping eliminate sentencing for debt, ending cruel punishment, and getting states to establish a juvenile court system. Dorothea Dix would argue that people can change if they're placed in proper environments and given an education. So when we look at this virtuous republic or moral excellence, how do you reform the human being? Because that's a lot of what this prison or asylum reform was looking at. Well, when you talk about how this government gets an authority from the citizens, which should be a selfless, educated citizenry, where elections should be frequent and the government should guarantee individual rights and freedoms, you weren't seeing a lot of this happening before the reform movement. You should also have a government power that has checks and balances and the need for a written constitution. Now, this is going to be what the United States was founded on. But there's one more that is brought up as well, and that's an important role for women, to raise good, virtuous citizens. And so when we consider that, that moves us on to our next reform. Because in the early 19th century, women were unable to vote. Women had the legal status of a minor. Women who are single could own her own property, but once married could no longer own property, and she no longer had any rights to any children she bared. 19th century women also could not initiate divorces. They couldn't make wills. They couldn't sign contracts. They couldn't bring a suit in a court without the husband's or the father's permission. So now when we talk about the separate spheres concept, in a true republic, motherhood revolved into this cult of domesticity. So a woman's sphere in the 19th century was the home. It's supposed to be a refuge from the cruel world outside where it's going to protect the female. Her role then was to civilize her husband and family in order to create a proper civilization outside of the home. For example, in 1830s, Massachusetts ministers said, "The power of a woman is her dependence. A woman who gives up that dependence on man to become a reformer yields the power God has given her for her protection, and her character becomes unnatural." So in the minds of the Age of Reform, when it comes to women's rights, the cult of domesticity was considered or equal to slavery. And the Second Great Awakening inspired women to improve society. You're going to have Southern abolitionists such as Angelica Grimke and Sarah Grimke. And you're also going to see Lucy Stone help edit the Women's Journal and even help form the American Women's Suffrage Association for the right to vote. Now, with the women's rights movement, when abolitionists divided over the issue of female participation, women found it easier to identify with the situation of the slaves. So a lot of abolitionists were drawn into the women's rights movement in order to give it more credibility. In 1848, a feminist reform led to the Seneca Falls Convention. This is the formal launching of the modern women's rights movement. This is also going to establish the arguments and the program for the women's rights movement for the remainder of the 19th century. And so, of course, we're also going to see a lot of artwork about this particular movement as well, where we can see a lot of people when they were drawing for, males who were drawing for newspapers, saw women asking for the right to vote, saying, "Down with the men," and we'd rather have a woman sitting comfortably in her home with her baby on her lap. So with women's rights in 1840, there's an actual split in the abolitionist movement over the women's role in it. As more and more women are entering into the abolitionist movement, there's a lot of men who decided they shouldn't even be taking part. So in 1840 in London, you see the World Anti-Slavery Convention. And two of the attenders, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, come back to the United States, and they form in 1848 the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments for Women's Rights. Some of the women's rights movements that were stated in Seneca Falls, New York in 1849 were the idea of an educational and professional opportunity. As long as the woman was able to be educated, why not educate her as far as her male counterpart? Why not have the same professional opportunities? If she wants to be a doctor or a lawyer, why not let her to do that as well? Property rights. A single woman is allowed property rights, but a married woman is not. Why not have any female, regardless of marriage, have her rights to property? Same thing with women versus men, give them the sense of legal equality. A woman should have a right to vote. A woman should have a right to bring a suit. A woman should have a right for a divorce. A woman should have a right to serve on a jury. A woman should have a right to be a judge. And the repeal of laws awarding the father custody of the children in divorce automatically. Lastly, and probably what most people remember the Seneca Falls Convention for, was for suffrage rights. Win women the right to vote. Now, the following is an excerpt from the Seneca Falls Declaration written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You're going to notice the language and wording is similar to the American Declaration of Independence. She wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Word for word, that is Declaration of Independence, except for two words, that all men and women are created equal." Continuing on, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward women, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. He has made her, if married in the eye of the law, civilly dead. He has taken from all right in property, even to the wages she earns." And as we continue on with the idea of he, originally in the Declaration of Independence, these were the problems and the concerns that we said about King George III and Great Britain and what they were doing wrong to the American colonies. Here now we have mankind, in particular the male, and what he has done wrong to the American female. He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming to all intents and purposes her master, the law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and to administer chastisement. We also have Susan B. Anthony talking about marriage and slavery. She wrote, "The married woman and their legal status. Well, what is servitude? The condition of a slave. What is a slave? A person who is robbed of the proceeds of his labor, a person who is subject to the will of another. I submit the deprivation by law of ownership of one's own person, wages, property, children, the denial of right as an individual, to sue and be sued, to vote and to testify in the courts, is a condition of servitude most bitter and absolute, although it's under the sacred name of marriage." Our next look at reform underneath that education umbrella is going to be the abolitionist movement. In 1816, you get the first formalized American abolitionist society called the American Colonization Society. And they wanted gradual and voluntary emancipation. Now, starting with that earliest part of the abolitionist movement, what they wanted to do was to create a free slave state in Liberia, West Africa, and to send emancipated slaves back to Africa. However, there was no real anti-slavery sentiment in the North in the 1820s and 30s. After all, slavery had petered out to nothing, and so you have this gradual emancipation actually happening in the northern United States. Now, the publisher of the newspaper The Literator, William Lloyd Garrison, decides to pick up the abolitionist torch and go with it as far as he can. He sent shockwaves across the entire country when he wrote that you should repudiate gradual emancipation and embrace an immediate end to slavery at once. He also advocated racial equality and argued that slaveholders should not be compensated for freeing their slaves. And here is the premiere issue from January of 1831. This was the front cover, the front head, or the lead of the Liberator. Free blacks such as Frederick Douglass, who had escaped from slavery in Maryland, also will join this abolitionist movement. Now, to abolitionists, slavery was not an economic question. A lot of times the southern part of the United States would say they couldn't free their slaves because it would ruin the economy. To abolitionists, though, it's not an economic question. Slavery was a moral, defining question. Most of all, abolitionists denounced slavery as contrary to Christian teaching. And in particular, Frederick Douglass is going to write the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass in 1845, and he's going to publish the North Star in 1847. One of the things that you see being published as well is the anti-slavery alphabet. And you can see, for example, our letters here, which is, to teach the slaves, the emancipated slaves, how to start reading and how to form their letters. And some of the reading is quite interesting, where you have the letter A standing for abolitionists. How B is a brother with a skin of a somewhat darker hue, but in our Heavenly Father's sight, he's as dear as you. And again, with the artwork, a lot of your Age of Reform is going to see a lot of artwork in the newspapers in order to push their political sentiments. Here we have the Tree of Slavery loaded with all the sum of all the villainies that happen with slavery. Some of our other black abolitionists we're going to see is David Walker, who in 1829 is going to write The Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. Now, he, instead of pushing for immediate end to slavery and the lack of compensation, he states instead that blacks should fight for their freedom rather than wait to be set free by whites. Another writer during this time would be Sojourner Truth, also known as Isabella Baumfree. And she's going to write in 1850 the narrative of Sojourner Truth. Again, any word that they can get out as former slaves to say, this is what my narrative was like, this is what my life was like being bound as a slave, would horrify people as to hear what kind of tragedies these lives were. And if this is what one person experienced, imagine what the majority are experiencing. So one of the ways that they were able to emancipate people of color before we had the Constitution and the American Civil War, which would lead up to the constitutional rights, was the Underground Railroad. And there are certain words that people would use in order to not say, hey, I'm going to help you become free. If you worked on the Underground Railroad, you were a conductor. So a conductor of a railroad is going to be the person who runs the railroad. They're the ones who are running the train, and a conductor would be the leader of the escape. The passengers on the Underground Railroad are the escaping slaves, and the tracks of your train are going to be the routes that they use to escape. Now, the trains would actually be farm wagons or other sorts of transportation that would transport the escaping slaves. And the depots, instead of that being where a train would stop, a depot would be where the escaping slaves would stop, a safe house, in order to rest and sleep. Now, the slave population in 1820, at the beginning of our Age of Reform, is mostly localized within the southern part of the United States. And by 1860, as you can see, it had just grown proportionately. Now, when you talk about politically, why wasn't more being done if there are all these abolitions and most people were reading abolitionist movements and books and narratives, and why was there still so much problem when it came to trying to end slavery? Well, politics. We have anti-slavery petitions in Congress. In particular, just in 1837 and 1838 alone, we had so many signers to so many different anti-slavery petitions. For example, we have the gag rule. The gag rule is passed in Congress, which nothing concerning slavery should be discussed. So under the gag rule, anti-slavery petitions were not read on the floor of Congress. And this rule was renewed in each Congress between 1837 and 1839. And by 1840, the House passed an even stricter rule, which refused to accept any anti-slavery petitions at all. However, on December 3rd, 1844, the gag rule was repealed. Now, abolitionism forced the churches to face the question of slavery head-on. And in the 1840s, the Methodist and Baptist churches split into northern and southern organizations over the issue of slavery. Even abolitionists themselves would splinter. More conservative reformers wanted to work within established institutions, using the churches and political action to end slavery eventually. But some were a bit more radical. For example, the American Colonization Society in 1817 pushed for the release of slaves and their return to Africa. Now, some Northerners even supported this because they believed that blacks should be separate from whites. Some Southerners would support this colonization because they would ship away free and emancipated blacks from the enslaved ones. And in 1817, 1,400 African Americans go back to Africa and colonize Liberia. Now, we also talk about workers and wage slaves. Within the Industrial Revolution, large impersonal factories surrounded by slums full of wage slaves developed. You start seeing long hours, low wages, and unsanitary conditions, lack of heat, children working in unsafe conditions, labor unions essentially being made illegal. And by 1820, half of all industrial workers were children under the age of 10. Now, by the 1820s and 1830s, the right to vote for laborers finally comes into being, and their loyalty to the Democratic Party led to improved conditions. Now, the laborers fought for the 10-hour day, they fought for higher wages, they fought for better conditions in their mills. And by 1830s and 1840s, dozens of strikes for higher wages or the 10-hour day were happening. However, in 1837, we see an economic depression in the United States that hurts the union membership. You also see the Supreme Court of the United States stepping in the Commonwealth versus Hunt, as the Supreme Court ruled that unions are not illegal conspiracies as long as they remained peaceful. And that's where we're going to continue in part 3 of the next video, where we look more at economic reform. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our Learning Language Arts channel. Check out part 3 in our next video. And as always, thanks for stopping by.